Good to go.
Welcome to Senate Education, Thursday, February 2nd, 1:30. We're going to do a walkthrough, start with a walkthrough on the summer study on income tax versus property tax to fund education. We're then going to continue our conversation around school safety. We're going to jump then into early childhood education and get a sense of what's out there right now. We know there's an early childhood bill that on both sides of the House and the Senate. We want to get not so much of an overview of the bill, we want to get a sense of the landscape of early childhood. Hear a little bit then from Jen Samuelson. People may recall she was in last week, State Board of Education, to talk about their resource needs going forward. And then Pensions 101. Those who watched yesterday will remember that we talked about teacher salaries, and we also talked about benefits a little bit. This will give us a sense of where we are with pensions, and then mental health in schools. So, and then a little preview for those who don't have the agenda in front of them. Tomorrow, probably start about 1 o'clock and end by 3, if not a little bit before that. And I think we'll call it a pretty good week. So with that, Ms. Richter and Ms. Shepard, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Great.
I think if it's okay with the committee, I will start off. I'm legislative counsel. My name is Abby Shepard. I think I've worked with a few of you in the past.
You could hit that got it button. There we go. Perfect. Now we can see it a little clearer. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. So does your committee like to have testimony with screen sharing, or how do you prefer to do the presentation?
That would be great.
Yes, screen share. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. My apologies. Great. Hopefully that is appearing. This is on the web page. It is under the committee's name, not under my name. Make it a little bigger. There we go. So this study committee was enacted last session in Act 175, and it did have a detailed list of charges that the study committee had to consider. And the committee did meet 6 times over the fall. Initially, the language did require meeting beginning in July, but there was another act that had a very similar study that was created. That was composed primarily of administration, individuals at the Department of Taxes, at the Agency of Education, and then with consultation with JFO. So once that committee had done its work, this committee began to meet in the fall and heard from different contributors to that study committee. They did then have their own report, which is also available on the legislative reports webpage, on the legislature's webpage. So you'll see these two, and there are some differences in the recommendations. So the charge for this particular committee, and before I even jump into that, I do want to say Julia Richter and myself, we staffed the committee, but as you know, we're legislative counsel and joint fiscal office. We're nonpartisan employees, so none of these recommendations reflect our individual views. We're just here to provide the overview, much in the same way we do walkthroughs of legislation or other policy proposals. So the Income-Based Education Tax Study Committee was charged with studying and making recommendations for shifting the existing property tax system to an income-based system. There is a list of powers and duties, what the study committee was expected to look at under its legislative charge. And what I really want to highlight here that came out of the first maybe 2 meetings when the study committee was meeting was that given the time constraints, the 6 meetings that they had to deliberate, the committee decided not to contemplate whether an income-based education tax should be enacted, but how it would be structured. So this report really focuses and drills down on the administrative side and some of the hurdles that creating an income-based tax structure would require. So moving on from there, I'm going to stop sharing so I can scroll without making anyone sick. I'm going to jump to the conclusion. This report was structured in a way that starts with what the charges were, and then actually answered some additional questions and did decide to leave some of the charges and some other issues that were highlighted to the deliberations of the General Assembly. So within about 30 pages, the report lays out the recommendations, but then also makes references to all of the work that was done during the committee meetings. And Julia Richter from JFO has a lot more information on what was modeled and considered and ultimately was not recommended. So all of that preamble, the committee did recommend if an income-based tax were to be enacted, the committee recommended that the homestead portion of the property tax, not the non-homestead, so homestead, which is primary dwelling and the surrounding land, that property tax would be repealed and replaced with an income-based education tax that would have progressive rates and brackets in the same way that the personal income tax has. So I just want to stop there before I dive into more of the details to see if there are any questions, and I'm happy to take a step back and explain the existing structure as well, since I know you've had some primers on education property tax, but I don't want to get too into the weeds until I'm sure that you know where I'm going. So I'll pause there.
I think we're good.
Good, great. So within, so you have the existing structure right now where you have homestead and non-homestead property taxpayers. The homestead property taxpayers under existing law those who are eligible both based on income and the value of their property can claim a homestead property tax credit. The recommendation from the study committee was to repeal the homestead property tax and the associated credit. The credit is where there's a lot of complexity that tends to confuse and frustrate many taxpayers. So that was one of the focuses of this committee, was how to address both the complexity of the system, how to simplify it, but also how to make it more equitable. And the committee did consider the general principles of a good tax system. That is part of the report from NCSL does have sort of a list of the different principles to consider for a tax system. So the committee did focus on several of those principles, notably simplicity and equity, but also noted that those principles, including progressivity in a tax system, can sometimes be in tension with each other. So trying to achieve one maybe at the expense of another, one of those principles.
And Ms. Shepherd, you know, you don't want us looking at anything right now, correct? You know there's nothing on the screen.
Yes, actually, why don't I will share my screen again if that's, okay. I think that might be helpful now. I'll return to that. Oh, just trying to make this bigger for you. There we go. So both the executive summary and the conclusions have a list of the primary recommendations from the study committee. I am showing you the conclusions because this also highlighted sort of the unanswered questions and the policy decisions that would need to be made to hammer out a lot more detail into what would need to happen to actually create this new structure. So as I said, an income-based education tax, if this were enacted, would be structured very similarly to the personal income tax, so with progressive marginal tax rates and income brackets. What diverges from personal income taxes, it would be on adjusted gross income, so not taxable income. You'd be getting into different definitions of income, but similarly to the personal income tax, it would apply to all Vermont taxpayers, so both residents, part-year residents, and non-residents who have Vermont income. The rates would be adjusted to local education spending decisions. So for those of you who are familiar with the Brigham decision in Act 60, the way that the legislature enacted Act 60 in response to Brigham, the state is constitutionally required to provide substantially equal access to educational opportunity, but the means of funding that education is not set out in the Constitution, nor is there a requirement for local spending decisions to be factored into that. That said, the committee did focus on local spending and local decisions as a policy priority. So the recommendation was to keep local education spending decisions local. So the rates would reflect those local decisions, and they would increase or decrease according to local education spending. And that would be compared to prior year average education spending. In terms of setting tax rates and the timing for setting tax rates, the committee recommended that the current structure be maintained. There would be some shifting and certainly amendments to statutory language so that it would be the education income tax that would be set rather than the homestead property tax yields. So there would still be the process where there's sort of this ministerial calculation by the Department of Taxes that is made public every December 1st. And then rather than it being used to set yields, that would be used to set the education income tax rate, as well as the non-homestead rate. And ultimately, the General Assembly would have the discretion to set those rates. And those would be based on revenues in the education fund and raising enough to fund local education spending. The way that the tax,
so the sort of the best way to describe it to constituents would be we're moving this direction. It's more about salary than anything else.
That's correct. So the education income tax, the tax base, what's actually being subject to tax, would not have any link to property. It would be purely income. So whether that's wages or interest income or business income, that would be the tax base instead of property. That said, I do want to again highlight this proposal did not suggest removing the non-homestead property tax. So there would still be property tax on second homes, commercial properties, anything that's not a homestead, so primary dwelling.
So one of the things I've seen over the years in Vermont, particularly in the Northeast Kingdom, I think, you might have a beautiful home, but you and your wife bought it in 1965, and it bought it maybe for $35,000, and now it's worth, I don't know, $500,000, and they really would struggle paying those property taxes. And sometimes it forces people to sell, use that income to buy something smaller, or even leave the state. So in some ways it would protect those folks. And really, again, but I could see in some other communities, maybe more urban communities, I don't know if that's accurate, but you would have, the people that are making the bigger salaries are going to have bigger houses. And so in those areas, it might be a bit of a wash. It's not really looking for, well, yeah, I would like you to respond to that. Actually, you can tell me if I'm heading in the right direction or completely off base.
Generally, yes. If I may kick that to Julia Richter, because I think that gets into looking at the actual data and the changes that would occur in the whole system. Shifting from looking at property with a credit based on income and property value, moving away from that and purely looking at income.
Yeah, sure. For the record, Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. So this is something that the committee did talk about, and we did do some modeling for that. I would say, Chair Campion, your intuition is is certainly correct for some property owners. But it's important to keep in mind that this would be replacing the homestead property tax and homestead property tax credit. So it's really determined how it would impact a homestead property owner is really that relationship between their income and their property value. So those are the two factors that are currently determining the homestead property tax liability. It's that homestead, the household income, and the property value. And then one step beyond that, and I know that Abby is going to get to this a bit further in the walkthrough of the committee's recommendations, but there's a potential expansion of the of who is paying towards this portion of the education fund, right? So currently it's the homestead property owners that are covering the homestead property portion, and many of them are receiving at least some sort of income sensitivity. But with the expansion or the change of the homes of this amount of money now being raised by an income tax, that is going to then, depending on how it's structured, shake out to individuals who do not own homestead property. Does that help answer your question?
It does. So if you could summarize for us, what was sort of the motivating factor of the committee gathering? Do you remind us of that? Was it inequities? Was it schools weren't getting funded? Was it, just general discrepancies around who was paying for schools? Like, what were some of those things in the early discussions?
Yeah, so there was in the early discussions, the committee did look at, as Abby mentioned, NCSL's 6 principles of good tax system. So those are things like fairness, equity, simplicity, economic competitiveness, and stability. There's the 6 principles. So the committee did discuss some of those and did have discussions, but ultimately, while a lot of those discussions did focus around that tension between simplicity and fairness, there wasn't necessarily an explicit statement that I'm aware of that the committee made regarding that, the answer to that question. With respect to the intent of the committee and the legislation, I'm not sure if Abby wants to jump in on that or if we would defer to the legislators what their intent was.
Senator Hashim.
So I just have a general question, which I think stems from my lack of knowledge in this area. But one of my concerns has to do with poorer communities where the salary is well below the median income in Vermont, and then your very wealthy communities. And one of my concerns is there's still going to be what I'm worried about is a lack of equity when it comes to poorer communities compared to affluent communities, and how those schools in the different communities are going to be funded based on the demographics. So I'm not sure exactly what my specific question is, but if you have any thoughts to share on that, I would appreciate it.
Maybe I'll take a first stab at it, and then Julia, you can add to it. So the tax rate would reflect local spending decisions. So assuming one district in a more affluent area is voting to spend more, that would increase the tax rate because there would be the prior average education spending. If they're spending above that, then that tax rate in that school district would increase. The individual's tax rate would be increased accordingly. However, they also would be taxed in those progressive brackets. So depending on the amount of their income. So if it's a lower income individual, their tax rate would already be lower. And then as their income is increasing, they would be subject to a higher tax rate. Those would be set in statute. And then the rate would be sort of either inflated or deflated depending on local spending decisions.
Thank you.
And if I may follow up to what Abby said, I mean, everything that Abby just said is, I'm completely correct. And I also think it's helpful to keep in mind the context that the current education fund, while we have these locally adjusted homestead property tax rates, it still is a statewide education fund. So in the current structure, the property tax rate is not a reflection of the property wealth in that town, but it's, as Abby said, it's the reflection of the local spending decisions. So that intuition would remain the same in the proposal from the committee.
When other states have moved in this direction, and I suspect have other states moved in this direction, I'm not looking at him, but I can see Colin's head saying no. But we would be the first state to do this? Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so there is nothing out there that says, all right, this happened, and then, again, from where I'm sitting, I think, and this would be, I'd be curious to know, and it gets a little bit to what Senator Hashim was asking. I wonder if we could see a pretty significant decrease in what funding would look like for schools, but I think that would depend. Senator.
Well, my assumption would be number crunchers would maintain the income, the revenues coming into the program, and they would adjust income tax in this case to match, to provide a sufficient amount of revenue to cover the current and projected costs. They wouldn't just create a system that underfunded the program from the start. I mean, all you have to do is match the current income revenue with the replacement system. Isn't it that kind of, I mean, simplistic, but you just have to find that equilibrium and then start with a new revenue source, being income tax versus property tax. Simplistic example.
Yeah. Ms. Shepherd, do you want to respond to that? Or Ms.
Yes,
Richter?
so the education fund and the way that education is funded in Vermont is sort of the reverse of the general fund process, where you have a certain amount of revenue that you then decide how to spend. It's sort of flipped on its head for the education fund. So you have education spending decisions that then drive the amount of revenue that is raised through currently property tax, but in this proposal would be through the non-homestead property tax, all other revenue sources, and this income tax. So you would not be decreasing the amount of funding for education through this proposal.
And potentially, to Senator Hashim's point, potentially a community could then decide they want to increase or establish an additional tax relative to their community, relative to their own needs, but that's separate from creating the general education fund, which would be filled by in this new example with income tax, with the tax on income. Community could bump up, could add an additional tax on top of that if they chose to. Yeah, simplistic perspective.
Yeah, that's when I need the simplistic perspective.
And how what Senator Weeks just outlined might interact with the Brigham decision if you're also raising additional funds, because districts do raise additional funds now, and sometimes there are penalties and all that kind of thing. Correct?
So when you say the word penalty, I assume you're referring to the excess spending penalty?
Yeah, the excess.
Currently, yeah. So that is currently, there's a moratorium on that for several more fiscal years. There is, within the definition of education spending in Title 16, there is already sort of an exclusion from that for other funding sources, including any governmental funding sources, fundraising. Those are already excluded from the education spending definition, and it's that definition that drives how the tax rate is set for that local school district. Sorry, did I just confuse?
No,
Can't
no,
quite
thank
see
you.
your
Very
faces.
helpful.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
I did also want to make the point that the education tax rates were not set in this proposal for that exact reason you were just discussing, Senator, of how to raise the amount of revenue that's currently being raised to fund education. If the tax base were to shift, how would those rates adjust to spending? And that there's a sort of cascade of policy decisions that would impact how the rates would be set. The primary sort of, I'd say primary because it's probably the most expensive policy decision, is what to do with renters. And that was one of the legislative charges, because if renters are paying through their rent, in theory, they're paying the non-homestead property tax, because that would be considered like a commercial property, because it's, even though it's a primary dwelling, the individuals living there are not the owners. Their property would be subject to non-homestead property tax, but renters would also be paying based on their income. So that is one of the charges that this committee was asked to look at, is how would renters either be held harmless or exempt from either the new income tax or non-homestead property tax. So the proposal in this report was to create a credit based on the amount of rent paid that would be available to renters to offset both the income, to offset the income tax, because the assumption is that they are already paying the non-homestead tax through rent. So I flag that because it is one of the more expensive in terms of what the education fund would have to support, is a renter credit, which would then impact tax rates for homeowners and other anyone else who is paying the income tax throughout the state. So that this report does not propose rates or the precise marginal brackets or structure for an income tax, because those policy decisions would have to be made first. Additionally, the non-homestead tax was not, a rate for that was not specifically proposed. There is one already under statute. It is typically not withstood each session to raise sufficient revenues to fund education.
Somewhat related, would one of you mind emailing us when you have time? I know I could Google this, but you get all these different reports out there, where Vermont falls in New England and then in the United States as it relates to property tax. I mean, I have a sense, and I've seen different things out there, but I would like to see that number.
A comparison of the property tax liability or rates.
Property tax rates.
Okay, so I might defer to Julia here because she may have
So
done.
for example,
this,
maybe
but-
I can be more clear and more helpful. House at $250,000, what's it taxed? What property taxes here in Vermont versus rest of New England compared to the United States, rest of the United States? I just be curious. I mean, I met with Chair of Senate Finance today. We know we're at 85,000 students. We're going down. Things, you know, we're spending. I think, I don't know. We're spending on students. Just leave it at that. What does that look like? For some people, that's a difficult number. For others, it's an acceptable number. And so some of these things are sort of floating around my head, and I think it's safe to say that other committee chairs as well. So just to get for this committee to get a sense of what's out there as it relates to property taxes on a $250,000 home would be helpful. And if it's not 250, bump it up to 300, 200, bump it down, whatever works for all of you.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really, you're raising a really interesting question that I wish I had a quick answer to. The challenge with comparing property tax rates across the Northeast as well as across the United States is that Vermont is very different from other states because of the very, very generous income sensitivity that Vermont provides to property tax payers. So when you've got a $250 home, while there's a few different things to be considered. One, the property tax on that home is really going to differ by community based on spending decision. And two, the total amount paid in property taxes when including the income sensitivity is going to vary dependent on the homeowners or the household income. Other states in the Northeast and across the country have their own property tax schemes that differ from Vermont, as well as the way that education is funded using property taxes also differs. So Vermont has these, the statewide education fund and the homestead property taxes, as well as non-homestead, go into that statewide education fund, whereas other states have different schemes for funding education. Many use local property taxes or some combination of state and local funding. So those are a lot of the caveats that I would, or considerations that I would raise when comparing property tax rates to other states. I can certainly look to pull together a comparison, but I do think it's important to keep all of those things in mind, that it is sort of looking at apples and oranges in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you make my question, actually, it was a pretty silly question. You quickly made me realize, of course, it's going to, differ, differs town to town, differs, not only in Vermont, but different states. And how do you get, one's head around that? I'm not asking you to do any work on it, but if you happen to see something out there that is put out by a solid agency or organization, it would be interesting to see how they've sort of threaded this needle to kind of give policymakers an indication of what might be happening state to state.
Certainly, I will look. I don't want to promise anything right now, but I can think of in the back of my mind a couple of helpful resources. And I will say it's not a silly question at all. It's a question that I've tried to answer myself many times, because it could be very informative for policy decisions. But as you mentioned, it is a difficult needle to thread in those comparisons.
Senator Weeks.
So I think it's a relevant question if we're going to start to get our head around this topic. But I'm also curious, though, about Ms. Richter's comment about the income sensitivity.
Yeah.
What's that really mean? Don't need a study on it, but I'm just curious if there's something which explains or outlines at a very high level what you meant by income sensitivity in relation to property tax. Because I don't, in this conversation to constituents, I can't get my head around. Yeah, anything would be helpful rather than current.
Would you say a few words now?
Sure, I can definitely say a few words now. I would also be happy to come back and do a big picture Ed Finance 101. When I'm talking about income sensitivity, Vermont has, you may have also heard of the property tax credit. There's a dependent on a household's property value and a household income. So that can generally be thought of all the income of the folks living under that roof. You compare the two. So the household value, the value of the homestead and the land, and the value of the income. And dependent on the relationship between those two, as well as the homestead property yield and the income yield, which the General Assembly sets every year in the yield bill, there's a property tax credit that may be applied to that property tax bill of that household. And so essentially, you're looking at two big picture numbers to come up with ultimately what is the total tax liability, or what is the total tax bill, net tax bill of that household. And that's taking into account the house site value, the homestead value, as well as the household income. Is that helpful? I know that that's like a few complex sentences, but I think big picture that covers it. Abby, do you want to jump in?
Nope, that was great. I would just add there's there are a few layers of complexity to it as well, because there is both the based on income and house site value for the state property tax credit. There's also something you may have heard called the circuit breaker that helps individuals under a lower income threshold of $47,000. So there's also a credit against municipal taxes.
And the credit against municipal taxes is paid out of the general fund. So the income sensitivity for education property taxes is covered by the education fund. And then the municipal circuit breaker that Abby mentioned is a general fund expense.
That's right. And this study committee did not recommend changing significantly in any way that municipal circuit breaker. But the study committee did recommend repealing what's called income sensitivity, or the property tax credit, because there would no longer be a homestead property tax. One other point that was made in the property tax changes and recommendations within the committee's report was to the non-homestead property tax. So property tax paid on commercial and so rental units, second homes, that property tax would be retained. It would actually be enlarged, meaning the tax base would be bigger, because it would apply to parcels of land, even if they have a homestead on them. Only the homestead, so the house or dwelling and 2 acres would be exempt from non-homestead property tax, but the rest of the property would become subject to non-homestead property tax. And that would help offset in part the expense of paying for a renter credit. There were a few other smaller policy recommendations, and then several that were, I don't want to say punted, but were left to the discretion of the General Assembly, because they would take significantly more deliberation. And those are listed on, this is in the conclusion of the report, which is showing on the screen right now. It starts on page 26. But I'm afraid I will have to leave you for another committee in about 5 minutes. So I might take any more questions or turn it over to Julia to talk about some of the changes that were contemplated but were not ultimately included in the report.
We also have to move into school safety actually in just a few minutes, but this is a good sort of starting, the conversation and helping us dig into this. I'm going to talk to Senator Cummings to see her thoughts on what parts of this she may or may not even be contemplating. We haven't had that conversation, and based on that, I suspect she will hunt some of these conversations right back to education for us to partner with finance on. So unless I see any other questions right now, I think we have your report. We have that overview of what you provided us with this thus far. Unless there's a pressing topic or issue one of you want to mention to us, or something, some concluding comments. Ms. Richter, Ms. Shepherd?
No, I would encourage the committee. Feel free to reach out to me or to Abby. No, I'm off for it. But feel free to reach out if you have any questions, or if you want to dive into understanding the ed finance system better. I know that it is certainly complex, and I'm happy to help you work through understanding some of those nuances moving forward.
Yes, please feel free to reach out with any questions. There's a lot more in this report that I'd be happy to share with you.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there for now. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Ms. St. James. In our packets, we have the side-by-side. I think it might have been one of the gentlemen from Rutland possibly asked that we, I don't remember who it was, somebody on this committee. We thought it made a lot of sense, and I agree, it makes a lot of sense to sort of see where are things now as it relates to school safety policies versus what the administration is proposing. So for those who may have just joined us, this is school safety. The administration put forward a proposal on school safety, and we're trying to understand still what direction we may head in. We are hearing from different constituencies, I believe tomorrow and next week on this. But right now, let's try to get a handle on what's in statute and what might change. So with that, Ms. St. James, and we hope you're feeling a little better.
Thank you. That's St. James Office of Legislative Counsel. So what I have for you is side by side. You'll see these more often as bills bounce back and forth from one side of the General Assembly to the other. And we use them generally as just a demonstrative way to show you the differences between the House's bill versus the Senate's bill. Sometimes it's your own bill as introduced versus the changes that the committee is making. And so this is actually a really friendly way to use this type of document because there's not a lot to compare. So to orient you to this document, the direction I received is the side-by-side on current school safety statute, what's in statutes now, and what's in the proposal. And so you'll see the proposal, if you remember, we walked through it last week, was relatively short. There were, I think, 4 separate sections. But through school safety, the concept of school safety is kind of woven throughout Title 16. So I included for your review Chapter 33 from Title 16, which is what the governor's proposal or AOE's proposal is suggesting, at least suggesting making changes to. And then I also included sections from Chapter 25, which is attendance and discipline, and contains the laws around guns on school property and school resource officers. And then I also contain, excuse me, I also pulled out some of the sections of Chapter 31 that have things on there like emergency medication stock and concussion protocol. So pretty wide range. But if we start at the very top of page 1 there, you'll see on the left-hand side, everything on the left-hand column is going to be current law. And anything in the right-hand column is going to be the proposal by the administration. And I've highlighted that new language in yellow. So the first thing you'll see there on the first page there is that the AOE's policy suggestions start by adding section 1480 emergency operations plans. There's nothing specifically in current law around this topic. So there's nothing on the left-hand side you'll see there. And then the next section you'll see, and this is what you'll see going forward, you'll see this more when we look at side by side. You'll see that in the left-hand column is the law as it currently stands. And in the right-hand column, you'll see the law that that AOE is proposing. So all that language that's struck through, they're proposing getting rid of, and then the highlighted underlined language is what they are recommending adding. And you'll see that they are recommending changes to current law in the statute related to fire and emergency preparedness drills. And then our current law also in section 1482 has a section on safety patrols. This is really related to schools organizing safety patrols that involve like crossing guards, directing students not to cross specific areas, etc. And you'll see there's no similar provision, there's no recommendations regarding this in AOE's proposal. And then we're on page 4 now. Section 1483 is current law, and that is a requirement that this chapter 33, is printed in manuals or handbooks prepared for the guidance of teachers. And you'll notice that AOE has no similar provision or is not recommending any changes to that section. And then that's the last of the current law in this chapter. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's the rest of AOE's proposal there, the access control and visitor management policy and the proposed section 1448. And then the behavioral threat assessment team proposed section 1485. And that's the extent of what I am aware of as AOE's school safety proposal now. But again, I did just want to draw your attention that the concept of school safety is kind of woven throughout chapter 16. So I did include some other areas that, at least on their face, touch on that concept. I don't know if you want me to go into them or just leave it there.
Ms. St. James, just one question. I believe the current 1483 chapter on printed material, handbooks and such, isn't that possibly the intent of the proposed 1480 emergency operations plans, kind of to have a, what do you call it, all hazards, emergency response, pre-planning concept? I would think, I think that would be what would be used for manuals and handbooks, guidance to teachers and schools and such. Isn't that kind of the concept of, again, it's not critical.
Here's one of my favorite ways to answer these questions. Intent is your area. So I can't speak to the intent of any proposed language. That would really be for AOE to speak to or for you to define. But you'll notice that AOE is proposing this in a separate statute, separate from what's in current law. So whether they intended those two sections to cancel each other out or to augment each other would be a discussion to have with AOE.
Okay, thank you. That's fair.
What was you expressed a concern when we first walked through the bill in particular? Could you remind the committee of that concern? It was related, and I don't mean to put you on the spot anyway, but you articulated it was, teachers didn't sign up to do a certain part of this kind of emergency planning. And I just want to make sure I'm noting that in this. And we're going to hear from the NEA and others.
Yeah, well, I was reminded of what I said yesterday when I heard 3 hours of testimony from medical professionals who've been assaulted and attacked over the last few years, which is just that these folks don't go into these professions to be skilled combatants or, skilled, what's the word I'm looking for? First line of defense. First responders. I know that some of the medical professionals that we listen to are definitely schooled in de-escalation. We heard a lot about that de-escalation training, but it's just, I don't know, the two are very disparate and don't meld well. And that's been my experience working with other educators. I think it will dissuade some folks from entering the profession.
That's helpful. Thank you for that. And again, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I remember you had expressed something, and
you can always put me on the spot.
Okay, then furthermore, you also said something. Okay, and we're going to hear, I think, from Mr. Robinson. Why don't you join us in the chair for a moment? Just for one moment.
If our president John Tinney is going to be here later today.
Okay.
He serves on the governor's safety task force.
Okay.
He's the one who's best equipped to speak to us on this. So I don't want to.
That's fair.
Step up
No,
and
that's completely
say
fair.
something in error.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
And so I won't ask you anything else. We'll leave it there. Okay, thank you. Ms. St. James, anything else at this point in terms of where we're at versus where we may be heading? This is a very, very, very helpful document.
No, this is really without knowing more about where you want to end up, it's hard for me to offer any sort of advice, other than to point out that the concept of school safety is again kind of woven throughout Title 16 in different areas. So just because it's not accounted for in the chapter where we're looking at adding new language doesn't automatically mean it's not accounted for somewhere else.
Okay.
Just to highlight that.
Any other final questions? Yes, please, Ms. Robinson.
So for the record, Colin Robinson, I did just want to say, and you all did hear from our president Don Cheney the other week, and he did echo many
Yeah,
of the
that's-
points that
yeah.
Senator Gulick said. So I think that whether you're a teacher, paraprofessional, or other school employee, obviously folks who go into first responder professions receive tremendous amount of hours of training to make life and death decisions in split seconds, as Senator Hashim knows very well. And that's not what necessarily teachers are doing professionally. So just wanted to, I think Don spoke to that previously,
Yeah.
and Senator Gulick's points, I think, echoed that as well.
And when Mr. Cheney's here, or actually, in case I forget to convey this to him, if there is an alternative proposal, okay, I would like to see that, or the committee would like to see that. Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you. Anything else? Okay. Ms. St. James, thank you very much.
Thank
We're
you.
going to take a little break and come back and have Allie Richards and Sarah Kenny at 2:30 take us through early childhood education, what it looks like right now in the state. So Aiden, I think